All right, guys, I'm actually really excited to record this module for you guys because this one is tying everything that we've learned together and applying it to your tests. Because obviously the final thing that you're going to be caring about is your marks, is your performance in the test. Nothing really matters if you put in all the work and then you get the test back and it's a disappointing mark, right? So what I want you guys to do is actually pay attention to this one first and foremost, but don't just watch this and not watch the previous two modules. The previous two modules are just as important. This is just tying everything. The previous two modules are just as significant because they are the building blocks on how to actually perform well in the exam. Properly pay attention because I'm going to go through exam mastery in depth and give you as much value as possible here. All right, sweet. So just a bit of context. I'm going to go through quite a bit here, right? All the way from what the markers are looking for to how to actually structure a response that's going to maximize your marks and know exactly how to even get those marks. All right. A lot of you guys say you struggle with knowing how to answer questions. So quick disclaimer here, as I said before, I can't go through everything super in depth. So if you have any questions, put them in the Discord, DM me, whatever. But in regards to the mentorship, if you are in there, I actually go through everything super in depth. But let's dive straight into it. All right. So first of all, I want you to understand markers are trying to mark as many papers as quick as possible. All right. This might be a bit different when you're doing your internals in school. Teachers are only marking your grade, right? So they might be able to put a bit more effort into reading your responses. But when it comes to the actual HSC, the ones that their final exam that's worth 50% of your ATAR, right? Markers are paid per question mark, per paper. All right. So they're trying to get through as quick as possible. So you got to understand how to write it concisely and use the correct words and phrases so that you can show the marker directly that you've answered the question properly. All right. They're not going to go back and read your response a second time, third time, just to find ways to give you marks. The first time they read it, if they think it's a 1 out of 3 response, you're getting a 1 out of 3. They're not going to go back and read the response again. So what are the markers actually looking for? Right. I'm going to go through each and every one more in depth later. But basically, they're looking for phrases that directly address the NESA keywords, showing that you've actually answered the question the way it's supposed to be answered. Identifying correct concepts, that's very self-explanatory. If you're identifying something way off, that's just wrong. You're linking back to the question and linking concepts to each other. All right, this is more the higher order questions where it's going to be worth a few more marks because they're looking for an in-depth understanding so that they can differentiate students that just memorize stuff versus students that actually understand stuff. And the fourth thing is very minimal. All right, this is literally just how if you want to structure your response a bit simpler for the marker for yourself, save a bit of time, you can use dot points when appropriate. I'll go through a bit on when and how you should be using dot points, but majority of the answers, you probably shouldn't be using dot points, full sentences, paragraphs, whatever. All right, first things first, NESA keywords. All right, this is super important. As I said here, it is dead ass the most important thing. All right, this is the first word that you read most of the time in a question. This is the first thing you notice before even looking about how many marks is being allocated, what the question is actually asking. The NESA keyword is the first thing you read. And the NESA keyword literally shows you how you should be answering the question, all right? The way you answer an explain question will always be different to how you answer a define or an identify or discuss or analyze or assess question, right? Every single NESA keyword has its own meaning, has its own way of answering it. So if you have 100% of the knowledge, but you give stupid answers that don't relate to the NESA keyword at all, you're not going to get any marks, all right? At the most, you might get 1 or 2 marks just for yapping away with the knowledge, but you're not going to get the rest of the marks, all right? And that's what most of you guys struggle with, right? Getting the rest of those marks. So how do you actually overcome this, okay? First of all, I'm sure you guys know this already. There is a NESA glossary of key terms, right? If you haven't already, go and search literally this up, NESA glossary of key terms. You come up with every single NESA keyword that they can use in the exams. So your job there is to understand all of them, right? Understand the definitions and understand the direction that they're going with each word. And the next step is to create a word bank of word and phrases to use to answer each NESA term. I'll go through what that kind of means a bit later. But the whole point of this is it's not enough to just know what the word means. You have to know exactly how to answer it. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be writing responses to the question, right? So you need to know the exact words and phrases to use to actually address the NESA key term, okay? Very important. And the third and final thing is to identify similar patterns of mark allocation for each keyword, right? This can only be done via practice, and that's where past papers are so important for you. And I'm going to be going through as well in this video how to actually approach past papers the right way. But just to get you thinking about this for now, you want to be thinking about past papers more than just them being a collection of practice questions. You are trying to find similar patterns between the sample answers or like full mark responses, so you know what full mark responses actually look like. right? So that's the whole point of identifying similar patterns. And once you find a consistent pattern, you can just replicate that structure for different exam questions. All right. So that's very, very important. All right, sweet. So as I said, NESA keywords, right? So I'm just going to go through a few here just so you can understand the gist of it. But obviously there's going to be lower order keywords and higher order keywords. Higher order is around 3 to 6 marks. That's a normal range of short answer responses, but lower order keywords, they range from 1 to 2 to maybe 3 marks sometimes, right? And those are your like define, identify, outline, right? Those are very, very simple. You don't really have to have different links between concepts and stuff like that. It's literally just kind of, let's say for a define, you just need to know the definition. Those lower order keywords, I'm just going to give it to you in your own time. I'm going to go through some higher order keywords, right? So what you want to do is I have these slides made, right? I have these slides, man. I go through each word very, very in detail with the students I mentor, but I just want to give you guys a brief outline as well, because I think you guys deserve to know as well. So with some higher order keywords like distinguish, evaluate, examine, explain, justify, obviously there's a lot more as well, but you want to be able to know exactly what each of them mean, right? And these definitions are literally copy and pasted from the NESA glossary of key terms. So very important, again, to actually understand what they mean. And once you do that, you want to be able to create a word bank, as I said here in step 2, that gives you a set of phrases to use when that specific word pops up in the exam, right? For example, when you're asked to evaluate something, you're making a judgment. So how do you actually show that you're making a judgment? You have to use words such like, this is because, this is a result, right? These phrases signal to the marker that you're about to make a judgment, so they know that you're addressing this NESA keyword directly, okay? So let me give you another example, right? Justify. Justify means to support an argument or a conclusion, right? You want to be using words such as this is effective because, this is supported by, this shows that, therefore, all of these words show to the marker that you're about to justify an argument that you've just made, right? The argument would be like the top portion of your response. That's all of your content. And then to actually address the NESA keyword, you would have to use these phrases. And just one more, explain. This one is the most common one in all exams, and I'm going to be going through this in a bit more depth later on. But this one is super, super common, so that's why I want to touch on this as well. It's to relate cause and effect. A lot of you guys, with the explain question, you just end up yapping on, and you still don't get the full marks. Not because your content is wrong, but because you're not answering the question properly, right? So when you're making explain, you want to be able to link cause and effect together. How do you actually do that? You have to use these key phrases. Therefore, as a result, this is because, this leads to, all right? So the whole point of you understanding the definition is to create yourself a word bank such as these that you can use in the exam so you can actually answer the question directly. That's the whole point of the NESA keywords. It literally builds the foundation for you to have a successful response. It's that important. All right, so this is a NESA glossary of key terms. Again, make sure, if you haven't already, take a look at this, actually familiarize yourself with these keywords, because this is literally the foundation of having a successful response. Again, this is the first thing that you're going to be reading in a question. So that's the first thing that you should be thinking about when you're actually structuring a response. Next thing you have to think about when it comes to writing a successful response is the marking guidelines. All right, you have to understand the marking guidelines. Literally every single exam question almost has a checklist. All right, this checklist is like the marking criteria, marking guideline. Every single box you tick, the marker is going to be like, okay, good, and give you the marks. All right, if you miss a box, you're not going to get the marks, obviously. Right, so the marking guidelines, obviously you're not going to have this next to you in the test. So why is this actually important? Right, this literally will tell you where and how marks are being awarded. And this is the second pillar, the second step after NESA keywords on how to actually build a successful response. Right, so once you actually understand the marking guidelines, you'll know exactly what to write, right? How much to write and how to write. Okay, let me expand a bit. Right, what to write is the content side of things, right? Are there specific concepts, topics, theories, formulas, stats that you have to state, explain, whatever? How much to write, right? That's the mark allocation. I'm going to go through that a bit more in depth down here. But the thing most students forget is how to actually write it, right? Can you have a successful response with dot points, or are they more looking for paragraphs? Are they looking for linking phrases? Obviously, they're looking for linking phrases because there's a NESA keyword, but sometimes you can have a successful response with just dot points. What do I mean by this? If a question has, let's say, 3 marks, right? And it says identify 3 things that blah, 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 you can literally have dot points, 1 dot point, 2 dot point, 3 dot point, and just list it out there, right? A lot of students waste time by writing full sentences, and this 3-mark identify question becomes a whole ass paragraph. First of all, you're going to waste time. Second of all, the marker has to sift through your whole response to find that 3. If the marker's in a rush or whatever, misses one of the sentences, you might not get the 3 points, right? But when you write in dot points, it becomes very, very clear to the marker that you've just identified those 3 things. All right, so it's a win-win for you and the marker. Marker sees it easier, make their life easier, you save a bit of time, okay? Win-win. Now, the thing to be careful about dot points is you can't use this for everything. If it's an explain, discuss question, you can't be writing it in dot points, right? I'd say dot points, you can only really use it for lower order NESA keywords. For example, if they're like outline 2 things about this, demonstrate 2 concepts, identify 2 things, right? Then you can have dot points to very clearly lay out your response. But other than that, I would say dot points, most of the time, don't use them in your final response. You can use it obviously for yourself to plan out a response, but be very careful with this. Next thing I want to talk about is understanding mark allocation. As I said here, right, this is kind of part of the marking criteria, but this is the last thing you have to think about before you write out your response, because it will literally tell you exactly how to structure your response. Once you actually understand how the marks are being split up, you'll know exactly what to write to get each mark. So I hope you can see how this is kind of tied into the marking guidelines, but understanding the mark allocation is super, super important. And I'm going to go through some examples down here with you so you can actually understand what I mean. So again, why is understanding marking allocation so powerful? Because it will tell you how to split up your answer, how to actually answer the question, how many things you are supposed to mention, right? I say things because it can mean a lot of things, but I'll give you a few examples, like how many concepts, how many theories, how many formulas, how many stats you have to mention, right? These are all the things that you should be thinking about. Now, before I go into the examples, you might be asking yourself, how do I actually know this stuff for the exam? How do I actually know marking guidelines and the mark allocation for the exam? Because obviously it's not going to be a set checklist right next to the question, right? So you're asking yourself, how do I actually predict this? How do I actually know what they're looking for, or know the mark allocation, know the specific marking guidelines in the test? This all comes down to practice. And this is why I say it's so important for you to understand similar patterns of mark allocations. When you do enough past papers the right way, you'll actually be able to start predicting what the question's actually requiring of you. And as such, you'll be able to predict what the market is looking for. So that's why I said I wanted you to think about how you're actually approaching past papers, right? Because I'm going to go through exactly how to practice it. But the way you actually get good at doing these 2 things is just by practicing, all right? And when you do practice, you have to really think about, okay, how do I actually get each mark? Okay, once I know how to get each mark, how do I actually structure a response that directly answers the question and everything like that? Okay, let's dive into a few examples now. Explain how domestic inflation can affect Australia's international competitiveness, right? As you can see, note the explain, right? The most common NESA keyword, explain. It's worth 3 marks, and it's the most common mark allocation for explain questions. Now, the whole point of me showing you this isn't for you to know the content, right? I don't expect you to know the content. These questions I'm going to show you are from the economic syllabus. But what I want us to practice here is, how do we actually go about structuring a response that 1, addresses the NESA keyword, 2, addresses the marking criteria that the markers are looking for, and 3, how do we actually get each one of these 3 marks, right? There's 3 marks for us to get. How do we get each one? Okay, sweet. So obviously the first thing we have to think about is what explain is requiring of us. It's asking for a cause and an effect, all right? Hopefully by now you can see cause and effect, that's 2 things, right? Most likely that's going to be a mark allocated each. So that's 1 mark for cause, 1 mark for effect. And the third mark is going to be about making the correct link in between these 2. All right, so that's another mark. So there's your 3 marks, right? So do you see how I was able to break down those 3 marks in order for me to start thinking about how I'm going to structure a response? This whole thought process comes before even writing down my response. Okay, a lot of you guys start writing a response straight away, and that's why you end up yapping. And that's also why no matter how much you write, even some people write up to like here and they still don't get the 3 marks. It's because they're not writing in the way that the markers want them to. Okay, so explain means cause and effect. Obviously that means you have to have the correct content. Now, knowing this, let's move on to the actual sample response. All right, so one thing to know about these sample response, especially from NESA past papers, they're very short, very simple most of the time. And yes, these are sample responses, but the point of the sample response, it will have all of the required content in that would get you the 3 marks, but it is not complex enough. But sometimes it might not be complex enough. So if you were to write this response and you had like a strict marker, they might not get you the 3 marks. and I'll show you why. All right, sweet. Let's just read the whole response first. Higher prices of Australian goods and services relative to the rest of the world will reduce Australia's international competitiveness. This is because the cost of inputs sourced in Australia will make relatively higher, making Australian-made products more expensive. As a result, this will reduce demand for Australian exports and increase import expenditure by Australia. All right, sweet. So this first sentence is kind of like setting the scene and kind of talking about what the rest of the response will be stating. It combines the cause and the effect, because it's talking about higher prices will lead to a reduction in Australian international competitiveness. Again, I don't expect you to know what this means if you're not doing echo. I just want us to focus on the structure here. And then it goes on and says the cause, the proper cause. This is because cost of inputs sourced in Australia, blah, 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 will make Australian products more expensive. So this is a cause, this is a C. And as a result, this will reduce demand for Australian exports and increase import expenditure by Australia. This is the E. This is the effect, all right? The cause is Australian-made products more expensive. The effect is because it's more expensive, the demand for Australian exports will decrease, and an increase in import expenditure, all right? That's the effect. So I want you to see how they've clearly mentioned the cause and clearly mentioned the effect, and how have they linked the two as a result, okay? Very, very clear sign for the marker that they've actually link the two together, which is what they're looking for in an explain question. Without this as a result phrase, some markers will be like, okay, he's just listing a cause and effect. So if this response didn't have it as a result phrase, it'd be very, very hard for the marker to see the link that you've been making. So that's what I wanted to show you guys here, is it's so important to not only have a proper understanding of the content and be able to write, for example, for an explain question, the cause and effect, but extremely important for you to show the marker that you've addressed the question and also linked back to the question by having phrases that specifically answer the NESA keyword. All right, sweet. Another question I wanted to go through with you guys is a discuss question. All right. Discuss is also very, very common, especially in short answer responses. Now, what does this question ask? A country has decided to increase its quota on imported beef. Discuss the likely impact of this increase on this country's economy. It is worth 4 marks. Now, with that being said, our job here, before we even write anything on paper, is again to think about what the marker is looking for and what this question requires from us. So a discuss question requires us to talk about 2 sides, positives and negatives. All right, you can check this in your NESA glossary of key terms, but in short, this is what a discuss question requires from us. It's not asking us to explain something. It's not asking us to make a judgment. It's not asking us to define something. It's asking us to provide pros and provide cons, positives and negatives. So with that in mind, if it's positives and negatives, we have to talk about 2 things. Let's divide the mark allocation by 2. Obviously, there's going to be 2 marks that's being allocated to the positive end and 2 marks that's being allocated to the negative end. All right, very, very straightforward. And now hopefully you see that 4 mark becomes a more digestible 2 marks, 2 marks. Now you can think about the response as, okay, I have to outline a positive, which is worth 2 marks, and then I'll outline a negative. And then obviously now that you think about it that way, it's a lot more easy to tackle a question like this. How do you actually go about and get these 2 marks each? Obviously, 1 mark will be identifying what the positive is. And then the second mark for the positive will probably be outlining what it is, right? Kind of going a bit more in depth. So a positive impact on an increase in quota of beef is this, right? You've outlined it. And then you say, as a result, this will lead to whatever. You outline a bit more, go a bit more in depth, okay? You don't have to explain it too much, but your job is to go a bit more in depth and get that second mark. So obviously, the same thing goes for the negative. Identify and outline, okay? Sweet, let's look at the sample response. An increase in quota is a move towards freer trade and would lead to a greater volume of beef imported. This would affect consumers as they would be able to access more beef at lower prices. This may see at the cost of other goods using beef as an input also for example, restaurants. Domestic farmers would face greater competition and potentially harm employment in the industry. This may strengthen international trade relations because of the reduction in protection. So again, first sentence kind of sets the scene. It is kind of what the definition of a quota is. It's a move toward freer trade, whatever. Again, don't worry about the content, but then it moves over to the positives. Right? This would affect consumers as they will be able to access more beef at lower prices. So how would it improve this response instantly and make it more clear to the marker that I'm actually going into a positive of the quota is literally by stating a positive effect of this quota is that it would, and then go into this sentence. All right. And then you see how they've been able to identify the effect of the quota by saying consumers experience lower prices. And then they go into a bit more depth as well. Okay, sweet. And then if we move on, you can see here, right? Domestic farmers would face greater competition, blah, blah, blah. That's the response stating the negative side, okay? Again, how I would improve this immediately would say, on the other hand, however, right? Those phrases show the market that I'm flipping the picture, right? I'm flipping it. So now instead of talking about positives, I'm talking about the negatives, right? So, however, domestic farmers would face greater competition, blah, blah, blah. Or on the other hand, domestic farmers would face greater competition. So again, yes, this response does have 4 marks worth of content in it. But if you had like a really strict marker or whatever, they might not give you the 4 marks because you're not using those explicit linking terms. So as I said before, that's why it's so important for you to have those linking phrases to make it super clear to the marker that you're actually addressing the question directly. All right, sweet. So those are the 2 examples I wanted to go through. Hopefully that was in depth enough for you guys. But if you guys do have any questions, pop it into Discord at me so I can actually get notified from it. But let's move on to past papers, okay? Now, as I said before, I want you to think about how you're approaching past papers. Past papers are not just a collection of exam questions. All right, I need you guys to understand this. Students who excel use past papers to solidify the exam prep. So that's everything that we've talked about above here, right? Not only do they use past papers to practice the knowledge and practice applying the content that they've learned, but they also practice structuring a response using the keywords being provided, structuring responses by trying to understand the marking guidelines, trying to understand mark allocation, and using all of that to start building that skill up of knowing exactly what the market is looking for, all right? So that's super important for you guys to understand. So don't just use past papers as a means to practice content that you've gained. Actually use past papers to also practice your skill in predicting what the market is looking for and actually answering the questions for what it is. There's 3 types of ways you can approach past papers: open book, closed book, and exam condition, right? There's a lot of students who just say, oh, I spam 5 to 10 past papers, blah, 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 think it will magically help them get good in the exam, right? It's not like that, right? If you do past papers a smart way, you can actually do less past papers, but get more out of it because you're actually practicing more, using the time more efficiently and getting more out of it. All right. So the first type of past papers you should be doing is open book. That's with all your notes beside you and that NESA keyword cheat sheet beside you as well. The whole point of an open book past paper is so you can get used to answering questions perfectly, right? The whole goal of this is to get full marks for every single question you attempt. So you not only get used to knowing what content the question is looking for, but you also get to know exactly how to structure and how to respond the right way. Open book exams. The whole point of this is to get full marks for every single question. Now, the second part is closed book. Closed book is literally what it sounds like. No notes, no nothing. It's almost like exam conditions, but you're just splitting up the workload, right? How I used to do it is I split up into 3. So sometimes I do all the multiple choice, then mark it, then half of the short response, then mark it, then the other half of the short response, and then mark it. When I split this stuff up, I found myself being less tired, less prone to burning out, because if you're sitting down at your desk doing 3 hours of the same thing, you're going to come out of it feeling so tired, right? But the second thing, which is the more important, why closed book is so much more helpful, is because when you mark your own responses right after you finish like a section, the working out and your thought process are still fresh in your head. So any questions that you got wrong, you're able to backtrack, see where you went wrong, update your notes, update your knowledge, whatever accordingly. All right. When you go through the whole past paper, 3 hours worth, and then you mark it all, one, when you're marking, you're probably just like mindlessly marking. You're not really paying attention to what you're actually writing. And 2, if you do get something wrong, most of the time you're already fried, so you're going to forget what your actual thought process is. All right. And then the third thing is exam condition. Literally, I would only recommend doing this to get used to the exam feel. But within exam prep, you want to ideally have a mix of all 3, right? Open book, closed book, and exam condition. But the thing is, I only really did 2 to 3 exam conditions past papers per exam. And that is for my final HSC exams, right? For the internal exams, I don't even think I did exam condition, maybe like 1 exam condition past paper. But the thing is, closed book past papers and open book past papers, I personally believe is more helpful because you get to actually put effort into prioritizing those skills, because you actually get to focus on applying those skills that you've learned. Now, remember, the point of past papers is not only to practice applying content, but also to master predicting what the marker wants to see. That's the exam mastery. That's the whole point of this module. All right, so this is a very in-depth module. And the whole point of me recording this is so you can rewatch it over and over again as you'd like. All right, I hope I didn't bore you too much. I hope you got a lot out from this. But again, if you have any questions, just at me in the Discord. But good luck, keep smashing it. You got this, Holmes.